Hi, everyone. So I am here with R. Eric Thomas, the author of Congratulations, The Best is Over, which just recently came out on August 8th, earlier this month. And we're going to be chatting with him about his book and some of the inspiration and stories behind this awesome collection of essays that are both humorous, sad, and every emotion in between. So Eric, thank you so much for joining me and being willing to talk with me about this excellent book. First, I just want to ask you to give a little bit of a elevator pitch to readers about what this collection of essays is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. So my first book of essays was called Here for It, or How to Save Your Soul in America. And we described that as a coming of age collection. It was a collection about coming of age at the intersection of Blackness, queerness, and evangelical Christianity in America. And so Congratulations, my second collection of essays, is a coming of middle age collection. And it follows a 5-year period where I moved back to my hometown of Baltimore, which I have a little bit of a complex relationship with. I think a lot of people have complex relationships with their hometowns. And Baltimore is a place that has a lot of various complex depictions in media, and I engage with all that, and then go through the normal things that you go through when you are, approaching 40 and married and in a new old place. The struggle with making friends, the struggle to find out who you are in a marriage, the struggle to figure out where you're going in your career, and then on top of that, the experience that we all had of going into the pandemic and struggling to figure out where we were going to come out on the other side. It is a very funny book, despite all of the sturm and drang, and I think that's the sort of core idea, that this life is has complications that are common to all of us, but it also has a lot of hope.
Yeah, I think that's a great, having read the book, I think that's a really great explanation, kind of what these essays are all about. And that sort of leads perfectly into my next question, which is what really inspired you to kind of delve into the complexities of, approaching middle age and kind of being in the middle of all of these different changes, moving to a new city, returning to a city that you have a complicated history. What made you want to share those sort of complex stories with readers?
Well, I was in a therapy session with my therapist in Baltimore, a man named Brian, who I got along with really, really well, and he had helped me through so many hard moments, mental health wise. But I was just like having this like weird anxiety about my career right when my first book was coming out, and I was like, oh, why am I not happy about this? Why do I feel nothing? And we were talking about it, and he was like, well, it's kind of common to have these sort of emotional plateaus as you sort of approach middle age. And I was like, approach what? No, Brian, I'm deeply young. I'm famously young, and I will be forever. And that kind of set me on this path as I was releasing this first collection of essays into the world. I heard from so many people, like, we're nothing alike, demographically or experience wise, but I saw myself in your stories. And I started to wonder if the story that I was living at that time, the story of like feeling sort of estranged from the path of life that I was on, and like approaching middle age, whatever that means, approaching it like very slowly, like in a little toddler car, like a big wheel, not like in a race car. I wondered if that was common as well. And so this is a much more, both books were very vulnerable, but this book felt to me in the writing scarier because I didn't know whether people were going to be like, this is unrelatable. But I have, in the couple of weeks that it's been out, I've received so much communication about it, DMs and emails, and people, the friends and strangers, just like saying like, yeah, this is something that I've been feeling too, and I appreciate you putting words to it, which is, I think, all you want out of a book.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear. And I'm not surprised that people have been connecting with this, because one thing I noticed about your writing too is that it's very voice driven. And I feel like your personality and sense of humor really comes across on the page. And of course, you've written nonfiction before, but you've also written a young adult novel. So I guess when you're approaching writing essays of this nature that are very, realistic and raw and vulnerable, what do you try to do to kind of let your voice shine and its authentic self on the page to connect with readers when writing essays of this nature?
I always think of the conversation. I try and keep conversation like paramount in my head, and I always try to write to the excitement. I always think when I'm telling somebody a story, whether it's on a date or like back when I was dating, or like telling people at a dinner party or whatever, if a story I love to tell, I think about how I get excited when I get to tell it.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh, I can't wait to tell this. You won't believe this part of the story. Not every story has those kind of like peaks,
Right.
but there's always like this excitement inside of a story. So I think about that a lot. And I think about um, the way that a book like this can hang out with a reader, that it is not something that they're going to be reading to learn about Oppenheimer. Like there's not like I did think you go to I do a lot of like book conversations for other authors, and I see
Mm.
people who've written more like fact research based books. The questions they get are so deeply interesting. I like the questions I get are very interesting as well, but like people aren't like, can you tell me more about famous horses of the Civil War? Although they should start asking me those questions at my book talks, and I would tell them more about them. So, this book is kind of a hangout. And it is like an intimate conversation with a friend. And so I just always try to keep that chief in my mind. And I got my start doing storytelling with organizations like The Moth,
Okay.
where you are in a room with people live, and you're telling them the truth
Yeah.
about life, and it's not stand up, it's literally a story, but it's a true story. And that taught me a lot about how to kind of ride the wave of a narrative in a way that keeps your voice like really centered inside the story.
Yeah, I love that. And I've been to the Moth many times, and I totally agree with that. It's like when you get up there on the stage, sometimes you know the story that you want to tell, and it's the story that you keep returning to in your mind, but sometimes it almost takes a life of its own
Yeah,
when you start telling it.
yeah,
Storytelling just can adapt kind of as we're moving through it. So I think that's really interesting. And kind of that reminds me of one of my next questions, which is about Baltimore, which is a city that you spent a lot of time in your youth and then left. And then in this book, you returned to living there with your partner. And I found this so interesting too, because I have actually returned to Pittsburgh, which is the city I grew up in. And I know a lot of people, I feel like, end up returning to cities that they grew up in, or they have family in, and they sometimes have complicated feelings about. So I was just curious, when you started writing this book, and especially in terms of writing about Baltimore, did your view of Baltimore change as you were writing this book, because you ended up living there longer? And there are some essays towards the beginning of the book where you're just first coming back to Baltimore, and then later essays, you've been there for a few years. So how did your view of Baltimore and those sort of complex feelings evolve over the course of writing these essays?
yeah. I mean, I do feel. I thought that I thought I had gone through the whole journey with Baltimore at the beginning of writing the essays, but even the collection itself changed as I was writing it, and the relationship to the city absolutely changed. It's
Mhm.
funny that you're in Pittsburgh. I love Pittsburgh, and I tell people that I love it so much, and a lot of people who are from there say like, why, and then other people are like, yeah, you should, but
Yeah.
it feels like one of those cities, and I think there's a bunch of cities around the country, one of those cities where like, sometimes people leave and they're like, I got out of there on the first thing moving, and sometimes people are like, actually, I like it.
Yeah,
Um,
I relate to that for sure.
yeah, and it's hard because like you sort of know it. All the ins and outs, all the places where it could be better. and people, and then for me, it feels like, and this was the thing I had to struggle with in the writing of the book. So many people will tell me the best parts of Baltimore, like, oh, it's great to visit art museums and restaurants and the harbor and all the headline things. And I'm like, yes, but I also know the places where it could be different, or the places where I didn't feel at home.
Right.
And so it felt important to get past all of that, both the grudge that I held against the city for what it could be and maybe wasn't, and the dream that other people were telling me about that I wasn't experiencing.
Right.
And to really see it for what it was, in the present, and to try and build a new relationship with it. I really started to think about the city as an entity that I was in a long-term relationship with.
Right.
And it wasn't a marriage. Maybe it was like family, maybe it was siblings. I don't know what it was. But that changed the way I thought about the city, because I had to think about my part in it as well, and my part in being both a part of the city and part of the solution to my own happiness. So
Yeah.
yeah, even late in the game, one of the essays where I really sort of detail the shifts, the great well. No, I think the beginning of the shift. There's an essay called "The Greatest City in America" where I write about the slogans on the benches, and I think that for me was like the beginning of the shift. But I wrote that, it was, I think, the last essay that I wrote, and it was a little bit farther into the process, and it helped to sort of look at the big picture of the arc and say, okay, I'm in a different space now. When
Right.
did that begin? And then to sort of be able to say, and that freed me to sort of really say all the things that I felt were lacking, and about the city and the experience, so that I could get to a place of resolution.
Yeah. And I think, as you were sort of saying, our relationships with the cities that we live in or have a history with are constantly changing and evolving. Like, I mean, in a lot of ways, the way I view the city I live in and how someone else looks at it is totally different. And, one of us might connect with something or really like something about our city, while another person might hate that thing. So it's really so much about perspective. And I felt like that came across in your writing, and also just the evolving of your relationship with Baltimore was really interesting to kind of see as a through line throughout the collection. And that leads me to another question, which is something I felt like you touched upon in such a relatable way in this book, is trying to make friendships as an adult, especially when you're moving to a new city, and how difficult that can be. So yeah, I was curious why, like, you think forging friendships later in life is so difficult. I was thinking, is it potentially maybe because of how connected we are able to stay with old friends in different cities when we leave? Or is it something more than that? And I just wanted to read quickly for people who are listening to this interview, this great paragraph you have in the essay, Another Person in the Room, that says, even when you do manage to send the text about an adult friends hang, the response is like, definitely, I'm free in 6 years. We should put it on the calendar now because I'm going to lose that open slot quickly. Okay, amazing. See you then. I will definitely not be too tired when the time comes and politely ask to reschedule. So that just totally, I mean, I feel like nowadays it can be so hard to make friendships, especially like the close friendships later in life. So yeah, I would just love to hear kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love that paragraph. I feel like I have that conversation all the time, over text. You meet somebody, and you're like, we're gonna be friends, and then like, maybe it's them, maybe it's you, but like, you're like, oh, let's hang out, and you're like, I'm actually really tired, I'm so sorry. And that's valid. I think that in my 20s I was tired all the time, but I didn't let it stop me because I was deranged. And um and you listen to your body more as you get older. But I think the big thing with adult friendships, the thing that makes it super hard, is the lack of forced proximity as you get older. Part of one of the reasons that we moved apartment buildings in Baltimore was because we wanted to just like have more people in our immediate vicinity. We're like, well, if we're in this apartment building, we should be making friends with these people. And that's even not even really the way like a lot of apartment buildings work anymore.
Yeah.
And but when you're in college, when you're in high school, you are just in everybody's face. Pardon me. You're in everybody's face all the time. And I went to college in 1999, and so there we had the internet, but we were just using it to like
So different.
download songs off of Napster, or maybe be in chat rooms. Like it wasn't like our whole life. There was no Facebook. There actually was no Facebook, and so we were just hanging out in the dorm lounge all the time. Anyway, not to sound like 9,000 years old, but the point is, I think that as you get older, you build a life around yourself that is the life that you want. And in my ideal construction of life, that life has so many different people in it, and the door is always unlocked, and people are just walking in. But the way that life works, it's not always the case.
Yeah.
Even I'm lucky to have a career as I write full time, and I'm like, oh, I'm always available. And then people invite me to stuff, and I'm like, oh, actually, sorry, I'm in Nashville this weekend. And it's just like you have your life, you have your priorities. Maybe you have kids, maybe you have, maybe you're taking care of parents or relatives. Life doesn't get in the way, but life, I think, pulls you away from the dorm lounge.
Right.
And then I think one of the strange things about life is that as you get older, as your kids grow up, and after you retire, you kind of end up back in the dorm lounge, but you kind of lost that muscle, right?
Yeah, that's very true.
And I think particularly for LGBTQ people, it is really important to. I've learned from a lot of older people that it is important to prepare well to be older at every age, and that is both preparing your body, but also preparing your emotional life and your social life. And so part of that is like, who are the people who are going to be around, and how do I make sure that I still have the capability of making new friends in all these different situations? It's a thing I think about a lot. I don't know. So my solution is just like, I just keep showing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what you have to do. And really, if you're looking to make friends, just putting yourself out there. And because, yeah, I totally agree with you. When you're older, you're not in the same kind of settings where you're constantly being introduced to new people like you are in college or when you're starting a new job. So sometimes the opportunities just don't present themselves. So I love the part of the essay where you were just talking to different people in your building, in the elevator, trying to, because sometimes you do have to be bold like that. And you don't really know until you put yourself out there. So I think that's one of the ways to go about that.
Yeah.
Another, speaking about life and people who are big parts of your life, I really feel like you and David's love comes across the page throughout this entire book. And there are so many great stories about the two of you and your relationships, from when he's speaking up for you, when you injure yourself and you're rushed to the hospital, to him proposing to you on the top of a mountain, or making sure that you get to have some really great one-on-one time with his father on the fishing trip. So when you were writing these essays about your husband, I'm wondering, were there certain points that you really wanted to get across when it comes to your relationship? And then also, speaking to that, what do you find are some of the more important things we can do as writers to make readers realize, that gay relationships, queer relationships are just as loving, complicated, flawed, and joyful as straight relationships?
Wow, that's a great question. I think so. To the first point, I actually I did not set out to sort of write specifically about our relationship, because I always feel like it can be a double-edged sword, particularly when you're writing humor. And I came of age reading like Irma Bombeck and Nora Ephron and Dave Barry, people who were very good at writing comedically about their relationships. But there was a certain way I think people would write about, like comedic writers sometimes used to write about their relationships, that were like, this person's driving me nuts, and that felt dangerous to me, because it's I don't know, we live in a time where I don't know if it's about the time or whether it's just about the, I don't know what it's about. But like I was like, oh, I don't want to add that to that collection, no shade to anybody else. But I wanted to make sure the context was clear. So in writing about our relationship, I wanted to always sort of drive um, some development in my my personal development forward.
Right.
And
Okay.
so, what's a great byproduct is that like he is so wonderful that like it just sort of comes across, but I get very wary of like putting too much out there because people get an idea in their heads and then they you like not only do I exist in people's heads in a certain
Mhm.
way, but then he exists in people's heads in a certain way, and like that's something that like he doesn't have control over, and I want to be fair about that.
That's a very good point.
But one of the great things about, again, it's a double-edged sword. The great edge of the sword is that when you do exist in people's heads in this way, and you're like, oh, what a wonderful, complicated relationship, is that it's like, again, it I think good writing invites people to consider themselves in a similar situation or to see parallels. And so if you are reading about this relationship that feels both like fun and funny and sometimes hard, and you're thinking, oh, this reminds me of my own life, that's
Mhm.
that's it empathy, I think, is one of the biggest tools, the greatest tools that we have as both humans, and also that we have as people who are seeking justice.
Yeah.
We start to think, oh, not only like it's not like gays are just like us, it's that, oh, humans have commonality, and that this relationship is specific and it has its particular challenges. I don't shy away. I write about how we are in an interracial relationship. I
Right.
write, about how we don't hold hands in public in most places, and I think a lot of people are going to be like, oh, that is not something that I think about in my relationship. So I'm
Yeah.
not saying like, oh, we're all the same, but what I am saying is, um, we, if you, if you, if the human in you responds to the human that I am, then that forces your brain to think, oh, well then any issue that I might have or any sort of subcategory that I might put this relationship in, that doesn't make any sense. And that's work that people have to do on their own.
Yeah, no, those are all great points, and I think the way in which you write about your relationship with David really does it's filtered throughout the whole collection in a way you're going through these personal experiences and growing and changing, but it just comes across naturally, and how the two of you kind of grow together and challenge one another and support one another, and yeah, I think it was really well done, and I feel like there's so much that you mentioned about your relationship that's going to really resonate with a lot of different readers. Um, but my next question is actually looking at the collection more as a whole, and that's about how you and potentially your editor or publisher decided on the title of this
Oh
collection.
yeah.
Of course, is "Congratulations, the best is over." And I love that there's an exclamation point in the title too. I think that just really drives it home. So I was curious. That's also the title of one of the essays in the collection that falls towards the middle. And I found that essay to be a really profound one. I mean, it's kind of focusing on some of the darker days you were experiencing during the start of the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, and your own personal struggle with depression. So I'm just curious, what sort of drove the collection to be titled with that specific essay kind of as the keystone?
We went through a couple different titles with the collection, and the first was "Determined to Enjoy Myself," which is
Mm.
part of Mrs. Peacock's speech in Clue. And my editor pointed out that if you're not thinking Clue when you see the title, it feels a little earnest and a
Mm.
little bit melancholy. And I was like, oh, people don't walk through bookstores just thinking about this one speech in Clue? That's weird.
Yeah.
And so we went back. I kind of struggle with titles a lot, and
Yeah.
I don't know why, because I feel like essay titles, I don't have any problem with. I love a play on words. I wrote for Elle Magazine for years. And so every day I was coming up with some sort of headline. And most of the time they would let me use the headlines that I wanted because I was writing a humor column. And so it was just like the most deranged things you could think of. But this one was a challenge, I think, because we wanted to nail the tone. And what's great, what's freeing about it. And so this was like part of a huge like list, emails back and forth, and we finally got it. And I think my agent like sort of helped guide me to it. And what's great, I love an exclamation point. I always want to put an exclamation point in my titles because you never see it. You never
Right.
see it in
Very
the book.
rare, I feel anymore.
It feels inappropriate, and that's what I love. You're like, oh, you're supposed to use normal punctuation when you're titling a book, and I'm like, what if I didn't do that?
Yeah.
I want to put a question mark. I want to put an interrobang. I want it all. I want an M dash. I don't care.
Yeah.
And so, but like, and so I originally did not have an essay that was attached to this. It was just going to be the title, and I think the essay that begins the second half was I think it was one long essay, and I don't know, it was called something different. I can't remember, I'm sorry. And then we sort of reshaped the manuscript into these two distinct halves where it breaks right at the release of my first book, which was February 20th, 2020. And then 5 weeks later, the world is very different.
Right.
That felt very much like part one, part two. And to begin part two, I was like, oh, here we are. So I wanted the book to have a sort of frenetic, like last moments of a party feeling. And so that's what the title wants to feel like when you approach it on the shelf. And then you get to the middle and you're like, oh, it also means this, and that creates, I think, a question that I get a lot of times in interviews. It's like people begin interviews all the time, like, well, do you think the best is over? And I'm like, well, you got to read the book,
Yeah.
But also like, yeah, that's the inherent question.
Right.
And you have to ask it. And if you're not asking it, or if you're not, I've been to so many random parties where I was at a pool party, like sitting in kiddie pools on my friend's roof deck. It's a bunch of queer people, everybody's in Speedos, and we're just chit-chatting. And then we seamlessly move to like, when do you think we should leave the country if things get really bad? And then we go back to being like, who do you think, who amongst us is going to go to see Kylie in Vegas? And then we're like, oh, all the citrus is getting some weird virus, and so that's going to go away. And it's like, we're always asking this question, like, is the party over? Right. Okay, what to do now? So
yeah.
So
and
anyway.
it's never that straightforward too. And I think you touch on that. Like, I think this title is thought provoking, and also it doesn't necessarily mean one thing either. Especially through these essays, it applies to so many of the themes that you're talking about. And I think it really just works to kind of sum up, in some ways, as best as you can sum up an essay collection about personal essays. So I think it's very thought-provoking and interesting. So it's very, very cool to kind of hear about the thought process that went behind discovering that as the title. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is about kind of when you're thinking about subject matter for your essays. Of course, some of these essays have a very specific theme, like the Clap Until You Feel It, which is for the most part about Oprah's favorite things, which I just found to be such a sort of light and humorous and fun essay. And then you have that, up against other essays that are a bit, sadder, like David's dad, dealing with illness and passing away. So I guess I'm curious, as someone who writes so well, both in these more serious subject matters and light subject matters, do you approach a collection kind of thinking that you want to have both side by side, or do they just kind of, come out of you as a writer onto the page and you just make them work together? I'm just curious about that juxtaposition between like the light and the dark.
Yeah, so there's this quote from Steel Magnolias that Dolly Parton says in the movie. She says, laughter through tears is my favorite emotion. And I think about that all the time. And it really, and like that also sort of, I think, ties into a an idea that is like rooted in modern drama, like Anton Chekhov. There's stage directions in so many Chekhov plays where they're like smiling through tears or literally laughing while crying, and I think that that is the sort of heartbeat of my storytelling.
Mhm.
And the challenge for me is that because most people came to know me as a humor writer, I fear a lot of the time that people only want to have a good time. But
Okay.
what I know as a human is that people want the whole enchilada. They want to hear the good and the bad. And when I'm like at a family dinner or whatever, and we are talking about funny stories, we are also talking about sad stories.
Mm.
So I think I always approach every collection with um, this is the big question that I'm trying to ask. Uh, and these are the good stories.
Okay.
And so the good stories for me generally are stories that I can riff on comedically.
Mhm.
And then from there, I have to give them the backbone. I have to sort of say, okay, well, what did that story really mean? Um, the Oprah's Favorite Things is actually like I was like, I'm just obsessed with Oprah's Favorite Things, and I really wanted to write about it. I'd love to just write a whole book of pop culture rants. One
Yeah.
day, I will convince my editor that it is
Yeah,
that
you're very good at it. I would love to read that.
I want to, and I'm like, I think what we are. I think that she would be happy to work with me on that if I came to her with a coherent, cohesive idea. So with Oprah's Favorite Things, I was like, I just want to talk about this show, and she's like, but why? And I was like, "Meh." And then eventually the essay got to being about emotion and feeling big emotion and looking at this change in my emotional landscape. But a lot of times I just want to be like, do you remember my best friend's wedding? Let's just talk about that for
Yeah.
3,000 words.
Right.
And, maybe, but sometimes you have to figure out the why. And the why often is a question.
Yeah.
And that question is often hard. And so that's where the emotion comes in.
Mm. Yeah, and that that actually goes right into my next question, which is in this essay, the last paragraph of the essay on page 95. It's
Mhm.
one of my favorites in the book, and I want to read this paragraph to those who are listening, and then I have a question for you about it. And it goes, I am not made smaller by the big feelings. They are the things that remind me that I am alive. They are the things that, when I'm in darkness, remind me that I'm searching for the light. They aren't always the things that I need, but I think that inside them, the happiness, the sadness, the joy, the grief, there's truth. I just want to get to the truth. I write to get to the truth. I watch to see the truth. I go to the theater to find the truth. I laugh and I cry and I gasp. And at the end, I clap and I clap and I clap until my hands hurt. And I think you were just sort of speaking to this, but when you say you write to get to the truth, I'm just so curious, kind of in your own words, why is that so important to you, and why is truth kind of as a concept important to you as a writer and as a person in today's society?
Well, I think that we are all on a journey to some kind of truth. We want meaning, truth. I don't know. I don't know. I see that's the
It's a
thing.
big question too.
It is like that. I think that's. I mean, that the struggle and when the answer is in itself the answer, which is that I don't inherently think that writing is capital I important, but I think that what we are all doing with our time, our days, is important because we are making an effort. We are making an effort to be in life. And so
Right.
the way I show up in life is as a writer as well as, a son and a husband and a friend and a menace and a nuisance and a nemesis. And so to get to the truth for me is to get beyond all the lies that my brain might tell me and all the lies that society might tell me about not belonging or being other or being less than. Um, and then the lies that sort of mortality tells you, which is that everything is futile.
Mm.
Um, and I don't think that's true. And a lot of the work of this book, I think, is about calling back into the room the things that are ephemeral, the things that have been lost. That's what I love about theater is that
Right.
it's ephemeral, it's never going to happen again, but also exists in the mind, can
Yeah.
exist in the mind forever. And books are supposedly more permanent, but this book will go out of print one day. And even, even now, it's out in the world and people are reading it and it's selling well. And yet, there are billions of people who have never heard of it. And that is fine. I mean, it's not fine. And I'm very upset about it, but they will one day. But like, there is to think that it is not about changing the world so much. It is about changing the space that I occupy, and changing me in the world. And I think that's very important. I think it's important for all of us to sort of ask ourselves, like, how are we showing up, and how does the way we show up make life better for the people around us, the people who come after us, and for ourselves. It's really important to me.
Yeah, and I think, when you're writing, especially personal essays or memoir, I mean, in a way, I find that I'm writing to get to like my own truth, and I'm sure that in some ways you're writing to get to your own truth, and figuring out, who we are as people and how our truth relates to other people's truth, and just kind of how we fit in with others. So I think it's something that's really commendable, and also, I just think actually vocalizing that on the page and like making the reader aware of this is something as a writer that you're trying to get to. I just, as a writer myself, really connected to that, and I'm sure other readers will too. One other question I had was, just because I would be remiss to not mention that the gay frogs. I love all of the gardening sort of essays, because that kind of comes up in a sort of couple different places. That you and David are redoing some landscaping and gardening, especially in Hosta's Negotiator. They said the Gay Frog Mecca and Rainbow Connection. So through these essays, you're kind of talking about, some of your struggles, and how it's kind of working out with you, kind of changing the landscape, and how you're almost, taking the emotional and making it physical in some ways, or at least that's how I sort of read it. But I guess, these essays were talking a lot about the struggling of gardening, but then you come to find that you're finding a lot of satisfaction out of changing the landscape and interacting with neighbors, and just seeing how these outdoor elements are sort of shaping your home and bringing you joy. So I guess what surprised you the most about these sort of gardening adventures, and was there anything in particular that you learned about yourself as you and David really worked to kind of change your home and landscape that you wanted to get across to readers?
Yeah, it's I love that the phrase "changing the landscape" keeps coming up, because it was like that is literally what was happening, but it's also sort of like that's the metaphor. And I wanted to change my emotional landscape. I wanted to change the way that I was relating to the world. But also, like, it felt like a betrayal of my personal brand to do all this digging and have all this dirt around me all the time. And, like, what was most gratifying, I think, at the end of it was realizing that it was still like a bad fit. I am actually not somebody who takes a lot of pleasure in going to Lowe's every 2 days, to get mulch or whatever. I don't really have I don't wake up desiring to like go work in the garden for a couple of hours, but it was something that was not closed off to me. And I think that I'm just trying to find more places that I can feel at home in the world. And I learned a lot about rhythm and a lot about patience from the garden. And, I would think, oh, you plant a seed, it comes up, it's beautiful and perfect. And instead you have to tend to it.
Right.
The garden is about watching and observation. It's different every time you look at it, which is like so beautiful as a writer. And also as a human, it's like terrifying. It's like this minute by minute, this is different. And I'm missing it if I'm not there.
Yeah.
And we would also we would find plants in the yard that we hadn't planted, and like they were just like the seeds were just in the ground.
Right.
We were struggling so much with weeds everywhere. And I remember thinking, like, these weeds showed up in this land who knows, a dozen years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. They, whatever is going on here precedes me and it will outlast me. And so that is both, like, it allowed me to like let go of the experience a little bit and say that this is not my space to own and command and to like to throttle into submission. It is a place that I am visiting, and I'm just trying to do my best while I visit there. And I don't know, I still follow all these like gay Instagrammers, and they're so good at making their gardens so beautiful, and they're
It look easier than it is.
yeah, I'm like, this couple, probably this. I love them so much.
Yes.
Oh God, and like they have ducklings, they're turning their garage into a second apartment, and they bought a farm, and now I'm obsessed with them.
Oh, fun.
And I'm like, that is not my journey.
Right.
But that's okay. It is not,
Yeah.
I'm not failing at being a person or being a gay, but just because I don't know the best way to plant a hydrangea bush.
Yeah, and I think what you said about the garden, and it has these seeds that maybe some of these seeds have been laying dormant. Like the garden is going to change and evolve regardless of whether if you are actually working as another agent of change. So there's so many different ways that things are going to move and surprise us. Just kind of it's a great metaphor for life too. It's like we can try to cultivate and certain things grow in our life, but at the end of the day, weeds are going to sprout, and we're just going to have to kind of roll with the punches. So I think it works so well in the essays. Just one last thing I want to touch on specifically is at the end of page 206. So there's a paragraph I want to read, which says, "Oh God, to return, to find a way back to yourself, the version of yourself that wanted nothing more than what you have. The version of yourself paralyzed by the fear of living through what you've lived through, the stranger in your story who had just enough hope to make a path for you. But if we could go back, we'd never move forward." And especially, where this falls towards the end of the collection, I think in a lot of ways it sort of summarized, at least for me as a reader, some of the themes of returning. And I think that's such a major theme throughout these essays, returning to Baltimore, returning to writing, returning to dealing with different things in society that have been challenging. So I guess just, again, as a writer, what about returning do you find so fascinating and emotional? And how did it feel to return to writing memoir nonfiction, but, at a different point in your life?
I love that you singled out that paragraph because I think of it as my sorry, I think there may have been a little noise there. I think of that paragraph as my 11 o'clock number, like as if this was a musical. And in the musical, it is sort of like the character at their sort of most vulnerable, but also maybe their lowest. And I think that is sort of the struggle with returning that I went through with this book, and even in the writing of this book, it was not easier than writing Here for It, which is frustrating because I was like, it should get easier to write books. I felt like I was really wrestling with this. And I think because when you return to a place or to a practice or to a relationship or whatever, you have not stayed the same in the interim, and you become very aware of the distance between who you were and who you are now, and you have to figure out what to do with that. There was a movie in the 1980s called Flight of the Navigator, where it was a Disney movie where a kid gets beamed up into a spaceship and he's having a great time flying around the universe with this spaceship full of weird gadgets. And then he comes back, and for him it's I don't know, an hour or something. But on Earth it's been, I think, 5 years, and so he's been missing for 5 years. And I remember watching it at 8 years old, and he comes back, he comes out of the spaceship, his parents are older, he's been missing. They've been racked with the trauma of having missed a child. It's a fun kids movie. And he eventually is he's overwhelmed, and he goes back to the spaceship, and he's like, I got to get out of here. And eventually he finds his way back to the original timeline. But I think about that so much, oddly enough, because it's you get confronted with the change first. And it is always a little bit overwhelming. It is always a little bit jarring because there are times that you think to yourself, I am the same person that I always have been, and everyone else is different. And that's not true. And then you see the way that other people are responding to you, or you see the way that the text is responding. You're like, I'm the same person who wrote Here for It while doing a daily humor column
Right.
about the Trump administration. It's like, well, no, you're actually a person who is writing a book in the second year of a pandemic, and you've been experiencing a lot of different things. But I think as a subject to write about, like, there's very little that's more tantalizing because it immediately sets up a dramatic tension, and it begs the question, where do you go next? And I think, in that paragraph that you read, I think, there's that phrase, to be that person in your story that was afraid of the things that you've already encountered. And I think about that a lot too, that like there is so much trepidation we can have about what we have to do. And then there's a person out there who, in our future, who's already done it and lived through it. And that's both hopeful for me and also terrifying because it speaks to the journey. You can see the difference. But that's the thing. That's what writing is about. I think for me, it's about tracking the journey and finding a path forward.
Yeah, I think that's really admirable, and I also just think relatable in so many ways. Thank you for sharing all of that about the book. Really, really interesting, especially having read it. It's fascinating to kind of hear how some of these thoughts kind of informed the writing and took you on all these different kinds of journeys. One other question I do want to ask before you wrap up is just if you have any book recommendations or if you've read anything recently, especially in the LGBTQ plus space, or if there are any queer writers that you're a big fan of. Our Instagram is really trying to serve our readers to let them know about different queer books, especially across the different imprints of Penguin Random House. So as one of our authors, I would just love to hear any queer books you've read. They don't have to be Penguin Random House books either.
Yeah, so there's a couple that I've just recently read. So I read Paul Rudnick's Feral Covington and The Limits of Style, which was just delightful. And it's packaged as a sort of gay rom-com that spans I want to say 70s through the early 2000s, but it's really just an epic story of two men loving each other through the decades. New Adult by Timothy Janofsky is his third gay romance, and it's just oh my god, it's wonderful. I really really like it. It's 13 going on 30 with a big twist, with a gay twist.
Right.
I recently read a book called This Terrible True Thing by Jenny Layden. And it is about a young girl in the 1980s whose father contracts HIV and then later dies of AIDS. And she has to navigate that grief process as she is, away at boarding school and applying for college. And it's inspired by Jenny's actual life. And I think it is such a important glimpse into a time that I think a lot of young adult readers, it's a young adult novel, young adult readers may not know anything about, and that we have to work really hard to keep present, keep alive for our culture. So those are just three that just come to mind. Yeah, I mean, they're all great.
Those are great recommendations. I've heard a few of them, but I definitely will be sure to check them all out. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. So this is Congratulations, The Best Is Over by R. Eric Thomas, and it was published on August 8th, and it's available anywhere books are sold. So thank you to everyone who is listening.